Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining me. Joining me on the replay. So it is quite literally the replay because this was a live talk originally that I forgot to record. So you're getting the second attempt, which will hopefully be an improvement on the first attempt, not because the first attempt was in any way deficient, just that sometimes when one gets to say things twice, there's a possibility of adding something that perhaps got overlooked the first time. So here we go. It's a rather ambitiously titled talk. I framed it in terms of popular misconceptions regarding yoga, and I'm not really looking to suggest that everybody's got things wrong. That's not the point of the talk. It's really just flipping around the title of my book, The Truth of Yoga, the other way, to see how it's easy to assume that means one truth across all time. And that's not actually how things work. And instead, because things change, we can sometimes miss some of the distinctions that lend more of the complexity and also richness to yoga traditions by assuming that what we think of yoga today has always been the case. So I've picked out three things that are widely said about yoga, and I'd like to interrogate them, so to speak, to look back in yoga history and see the extent to which they're true. So let's dive in. The first one, and you'll see this almost anywhere, that you ask the question, what is yoga? The statement that comes back again and again is yoga means union. And the reason for that is here. It's very clear on the slide. It's associated with the concept of joining things together traditionally in Sanskrit. The word yoga is a Sanskrit word. It comes from a verbal root yuj. And one of the meanings of yuj as a verb is to join, to connect, to put together. The yoke that jumps out there from this word cloud, assembled from the Monier-Williams Sanskrit Dictionary, is sounding very much like yoga, and is particularly associated with the earliest use of the word yoga, the connection of an animal to a cart or a chariot for purpose of agriculture or perhaps for battle. And originally this word yoga had nothing to do with what we might today associate with it. You have to go scouting around on this chart to see a few hints of what that might be. It's all too easy to assume yoga means union, but union with what? What's being joined to what? We'll come to some common suggestions of what that might be in a moment. But for most of the early history of yoga, at least, yoga is associated with another context in which the verb yuj is used, to mean concentration, to mean focusing the mind, perhaps therefore connecting the mind with an object of concentration, focus, or meditation. We have here above the letter O, three words that all sort of allude to what you encounter in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, the concentration of the mind on an object, fixing it therefore in one place, and slipping into meditation. There's also elsewhere contemplation on the chart, but all sorts of other stuff that doesn't seem to have anything to do with what we might think of in relation to yoga. So I need to, I think, really emphasize the distinction between these different definitions, and also the importance of that second idea, the yoking in the sense of concentrating rather than in the sense of joining, because for most of the early history of yoga, that's what's going on. Now, if you look at most places we could turn to today, that's not what you're going to find. You'll find all the possible definitions jumbled together as if they always mean the same thing. The word yoga means union, says a random example from a modern Indian guru. You consciously obliterate the boundaries of individuality and reverberate with the rest of the cosmos. And as we'll see in a moment, that's certainly a philosophical concept that goes back thousands of years. But was it associated with yoga? That we need to hold in our minds as a possible distinction in itself. And coming down to the second of the quotes from B.K.S. Iyengar's book on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, we see the joining of this idea of joining with what Patanjali himself was actually talking about, which isn't really joining. The middle line there of Iyengar's word cloud of his own almost, and he's got a glossary at the back of his Yoga Sutras book, in which he's really just summarizing all the different meanings of yoga associated with what we today think of as yoga. So there's a lot of joining going on the top, and then at the bottom, joining of some particular things, union with God, the integration of the body, the mind, and the spirit, all things that you might encounter in text, certainly, but not Patanjali's text. Patanjali's text is actually saying the opposite of those things. He's not saying that the ultimate goal is to unite with the divine. He says at one point that a devotional mindset can help you to steady your mind, but his main objective is the steadying of the mind, meditation, concentration. That's really what he's teaching. And he's certainly not saying integrate the body, mind, and the spirit. He's saying, actually, the purpose of yoga, the real outcome of yoga is the separation of the spirit from the body and the mind. So it's the very opposite of union. It's disconnecting those things rather than integrating them. So let's look at where all of that comes from and start to see how things fit together. But first, I think we need to go back to union and acknowledge, of course, the Upanishads present a very coherent and well-developed set of explanations of an inner connection between that which can be experienced in this mind and body, the Atman, and the true self, not just the idea of me, which is a distraction from seeing that true self, and everything else in the cosmos. So Atman and Brahman, they're said to be the same thing. There is an underlying oneness to existence. And this phrase from the earliest of the Upanishads, going back, well over 2,500 years, somewhere between there and 3,000 years ago, Ayam Atma Brahma, it says, this self is Brahman. There is no distinction ultimately between anything. Everything is ultimately one. And then we have an account here from a yoga text of about 1,000 years ago of how that is connected to yoga. The individual self, the Jivatman, and the Paramatman, the supreme self, can be known as one through yoga. But that's the first time that yoga is connected to this concept of oneness, at least in terms of texts that survive. We might well say, well, surely that was what was implied by these earlier descriptions, but I think we have to hold open the possibility that it wasn't, because when yoga is described in earlier texts, it's associated with a different philosophical perspective. And actually this one, which evolves into the philosophy known as Vedanta, rejects the philosophy of yoga, as we'll see in a moment, for not having the same perspective. Nonetheless, the idea of union, connection, integration is very popular from 1,000 years ago forwards, influenced by this sort of non-dual Vedanta philosophy, but also a similar tendency that comes out of tantric philosophies. And so when you get physical yoga texts, this example, the Yoga Bija, from somewhere around 800 years ago, maybe, talks about the integration of all possible dualities, the oneness of all things again. That's called yoga, it says, and then starts by listing various polarities in the body that can be harmonized and integrated through physical practice. And ultimately the middle line, the individual and the supreme can be seen as one. So sure, the history of blurring things together and making it all about oneness goes back a lot further than B.K.S. Iyengar or Satguru. We're talking about centuries of development of this idea. But if we assume that it's always been the same way, I think we'll misunderstand something about what early yoga was like and how it was practiced, as well as perhaps not really grasping what's going on in some of the most important and popular yoga texts, like Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. So let's have a look at what that consists of instead. those who know it well will recognize this philosophical framework from the philosophy known as Sankhya, which is a fundamentally dualistic philosophy. Instead of all things being one, all things are always two. There are two entities in the world, Purusha, which is pure consciousness, a witnessing presence, inert, inactive, timeless, it just is. And that's the true self to which one must aspire if one wishes to be liberated from the cycle of suffering. And everything else in the world comes under the heading of Prakriti, which evolves into the subtlest states of mind and then into the sensory apparatus with which we engage in the world, and also the body and all of the things of which it's made, and also everything out there and all the stuff that's made from too. The whole world, in fact, therefore, is Prakriti. And the practice of yoga consists of seeing through any identification with that stuff, winding it all back up into itself, throwing it away, and instead turning in the opposite direction to rest forever in this transcendent awareness, the Purusha. So it's a philosophy of disconnection, disunion, separation fundamentally, not integration. And this is described very clearly in the first text that associates this philosophy with yoga, the Katha Upanishad, another of the early Upanishads from somewhere around between 2,000 and 2,500 years ago. And it speaks here about this Purusha. Purusha is the Sanskrit for the word translated person. And this Purusha, size of a thumb, lurking in our hearts, needs to be known. But the way that one knows this true self, the entity that is Purusha, that has to be realized, is to draw it out of the body. So to detach it, to separate the spirit from the body. And then only will one know this person as immortal and bright, and therefore transcend cycles of death and rebirth and rest forever in this blissful brightness of clarity. This is different. Quite clearly, it's a philosophy of detaching one thing from another thing, not seeing them all as connected. And that's the basis of what Patanjali teaches. And Patanjali makes it even clearer. It's crystal clear in the Yoga Sutra. There's no possible way that yoga could mean union for Patanjali, because he says very clearly in the second chapter, connection between things, between these two entities, the Purusha and Prakriti, some yoga is the word used. The conjunction between these two things is what causes the suffering that yoga is supposed to liberate you from. So union is the problem, not the solution. The solution is to cease misperceiving things, to stop being identified with the mind, the body, the senses, and everything else that is the world, and instead to detach forever, to disentangle this Purusha from Prakriti, as described in the Katha Upanishad. And that state, this liberated state, is known as Kaivalya. Aloneness is literally what that means. One entity separate from everything else. That's the state of freedom. One rests forever in this state of clear seeing and nothing else. That's it. And obviously, this is not the same as the philosophy of oneness. And it was clearly understood to be different. Around the time that Patanjali was putting together his sutras, there is another text, another sutra text, the foundational sutra text of the Vedanta philosophy, which in its earliest forms was really summarizing the ideas of the Upanishads about oneness, and saying that is the truth of the way that the world is. And because yoga, which is based on Sankhya, which is dualistic, doesn't see things that way, it cannot be of any validity when it comes to explaining how to get liberated. Therefore, yoga is refuted. And it's pretty crystal clear in this text, the Brahma Sutra, very influential text. So that blurring together of two things that are opposites was well understood to be basically impossible originally. And although some of the commentators on the Brahma Sutra, particularly Shankara, in the 8th century or so, did acknowledge that yoga has some benefits because it can help you to concentrate and therefore perhaps see the truth in terms of oneness, he did say that Patanjali's idea of where that leads in the Yoga Sutra is misleading, and therefore you can only borrow the methodology, not the philosophy of how it's going to set you free. So quick survey there, that the two things that are combined today didn't always belong together, don't actually fit together, and are fundamentally contradictory. It's either 1 + 1 = 2, there are two things that are separate, or it's 1 + 1 = 1, everything collapses into the soup of integration. It's not possible to do both things at once. And I think we understand yoga philosophy a little more clearly when we see these differences, and see which one speaks to us. You don't have to follow one or the other. It's our fortune at this stage in history to have access to all of these different developments. But I think it's therefore also important to see how they differ rather than making them all the same, because they were very clear way back when that they weren't. So moving on to number 2, we've had yoga isn't union necessarily. Similarly, you go into the modern yoga world and people talk about doing yoga, practicing yoga. Yoga is fundamentally a practice in the way that it's understood today. But it wasn't for most of its history. In fact, certainly in the way it's presented in all the early texts, and certainly the Yoga Sutra, is as the outcome of practice. It's a state of being, but really a state beyond normal existence. And here is the first definition of that from the Katha Upanishad. We've already seen a text that really sort of blazes a trail for yoga, defines it as a thing that is clearly identifiable with meditation, and also integrates it in this Sankhya philosophy of understanding the difference between things. Making wise choices is another important feature of how the Katha Upanishad defines things. A very influential text, very influential on the Bhagavad Gita also. But just to come back to the state of yoga, it's pretty clear what it consists of. It's shutting things down. The mind is one of the senses, and the senses, including the mind, are controlled. Once that control is firmly established, then you're in the state of yoga. Then the reason you're in the state of yoga is because you're no longer distracted. Your mind and your senses are not interested in anything out there. They're internalized. Hopefully on the thumb-sized person that will enable us to rest forever in immortal brightness, but certainly not out there in the world of everyday life. This is a stepping away from the world approach, and the outcome of doing whatever is done is this state of yoga. And it's clear from this sort of fuller description that you get in that definition of the state of yoga. It's the highest state, it says, and it's defined in terms of Sankhya philosophy. And it involves shutting down engagement with the world through the body, through the senses, through the mind, and seeing something beyond that. Seeing beyond the mind, seeing beyond attachment to the body, certainly not trying to integrate the mind and the body with the spirit. The spirit is to be set free from the mind and the body by getting the mind and the body totally under control, firmly reined in. That's the way it's presented. So it's a strong renunciatory practice of turning away from the world. And that's the basis of what Patanjali is teaching. The state of yoga, again, is everything stilled. The outcome of everything being stilled is the resting in awareness of the seer, the Purusha, the witness, the pure consciousness. The problem, if you don't manage to succeed in that endeavor, is you're entangled in the world, caught up in the changing states, not just of the mind, really, but of all things that are in flux. Engagement in that world outside is the source of suffering, because the mind, it works in a very simple way. It categorizes everything into stuff we like and stuff we don't like, and strives to attain more of that which we like and strives to stay away from that which we don't like. And the senses are the machinery through which we get the information of like, don't like. So all the time that's active, and we're active out there in the world, we are caught up in the changing states of things that don't always conform to our fantasy that we can control it all and deliver a surefire hit of satisfaction, because what we want we don't always get, and all sorts of things happen that were never wanted in the first place, including death. So these philosophies were trying to engage with that fact and saying, no, okay, the only way to get any sense of control over it all is to step away from the world. But it doesn't mean that the practice is to try and wrestle the mind into submission. That would be a very frustrating endeavor, I think, described by Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita as like trying to control the wind. You can't just switch the mind off. There's no off switch. You have to give it something else to do. So yoga isn't the thing that one does. Yoga is the outcome of doing this thing. And that's much more clearly explained in the commentary that accompanies Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, less often read in the modern yoga world than the little pithy sutras themselves, which lend themselves to very freestyle interpretations. But the commentary, which accompanies them, probably written at the same time, most likely scholars now think by the same author, has a lot more to say about the original intention of some of these ideas. And before we even get yoga being the stilling of the changing states of the mind, chitta vritti nirodha, this term yoga is also clarified in a footnote to the very first sutra. So Patanjali is really writing his own explanations, saying this is how I want to put across the deeper significance of what I'm saying. So this first sutra just says, now for yoga, basically, atta yoganushasana. But what is yoga? Well, yoga, he says, is samadhi. Samadhi is basically concentration. Samadhi is one of the meanings of this verb yuj, to understand yoking in terms of concentrating. That's the way it's defined in an ancient database of verb roots in the Sanskrit language. And so for Patanjali, it's definitely not union, as we've already seen philosophically, but also practically, it's concentration. That's what he's teaching. So samadhi, the ultimate goal. The state, again, is yoga. Yoga is the outcome. It is this state of total absorption in meditation, clarity, really, of mind. However, he does not say that it's at the top of the stairway to heaven, the pot at the foot of the rainbow. It's not some sort of distant and elusive quality. It's there at all times in the mind. It's just the clarity, the radiance that lies behind the busy mind. Unfortunately, because the mind is busy, it tends towards three things that are very unhelpful. The text explains it gets distracted, it gets confused, and it jumps around, it gets agitated. These things are not part of yoga, it goes on to say, because they overpower this clarity of samadhi, which is there in the background all the time. So in order for that to shine through and to rest in this pure presence, one has to find some way of getting things under control, as the Katha Upanishad put it. And the thing that we can do is to deal with the other two states of mind that are listed there. One, restrained. Niruddha is the word there for restrained. Exactly the same, really, as the definition of yoga that follows in the next sutra, the restraint of the movements of the mind. So that's the highest objective. But you don't restrain the mind to restrain it. Instead, you get the mind into a state of focus in order to lead to this state of restraint. You meditate, you give the mind an object of focus. And then it says very clearly, when the mind is single pointed, absolutely one pointed on its object of focus, that is what leads towards this outcome of suppression, restraint, nirodha of all mental activity. So you don't try and wrestle your own mind, you focus on an object. You meditate. Yoga was meditation for most of its early history. There was no distinction between these things. And we see this very clearly in another very important early yoga text, the Mahabharata, which explains that this state of yoga, this state of clarity, is best accessed via meditation. In fact, really, it is meditation. The way that yoga is presented in the Mahabharata is very similar. A lot of these descriptions to both the philosophy that's presented in the Yoga Sutra, but also the teachings on practice that are presented by the Buddha. And all of these ideas have come from a common source, a world-renouncing attempt to see through the illusion of me. And you do that by engaging the mind on something that will get it anchored so that you can start to just see clearly. And the two tools that are recommended are one-pointed focus or breath control, holding the breath that thins through the distractions, the impurities in the mind, as Patanjali puts it later in the Yoga Sutra. So that's how it works. That's the basic mechanism. The practice is meditation, and it leads to the state of yoga. And we see a compound that makes that very clear in the Sanskrit language in this particular account, one of many in the Mahabharata. Compound dhyana yoga, joining the two together. Now, you could go back to the very first slide where yoga means many different things. And one of the things it really means is a method, a means, a discipline of doing things, and say, this just means meditation practice, dhyana yoga. But I think it's probably clearer if we understand it in terms of yoga being the state and dhyana being the means of attaining it. And that's how the compound can function in Sanskrit. And it's also how many other compounds, including the word yoga, seem to operate. So attaining this state by means of a practice, and the practice is clarified. It's exactly what we've seen already. Getting the mind and the senses focused and anchored on a point, and that eliminates unsteadiness. That's the stability of mind required to go further with yoga practice. So yoga is the concentration of the mind. that's really all that Patanjali was saying with his Chittavritti Nirodha. You meditate to concentrate your mind so that stillness can come through naturally. And there are many other ways of going about it that emerge as yoga evolves from those early days towards the present. So coming now into the medieval era of physical yoga practice, Hatha Yoga, one of the first texts to teach this practice, the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, says it's one of four options, Hatha Yoga. It's translated here as yoga of force. The word Hatha does mean force. It's yoga by means of sort of strong, intense physical activity, really. Including non-seated postures, but also all sorts of energetic stuff. And that's contrasted to two earlier approaches to a state of clear mind that come out of tantric philosophy and practice. The recitation of mantras, so chanting mantras, a pretty good way to steady your mind. Similarly, the techniques known as laya, which involved a dissolving of the mind through various subtle tantric practices of understanding the interconnection of things. So there are, at this point, lots of philosophies coming together, but one thing remains unchanged. The unchanging thing is this timeless state of yoga. It's beyond time, it just is. It's the state of just empty mind, beyond the mind, pure consciousness. And the fourth of those options, Raja Yoga, is basically a synonym for that. That's why it's said to be the best. It's royal yoga. It doesn't quite work in the same way, that compound, but does point to just the superiority of just yoga as the absolute and fully absorbed state of clarity. The Bhagavad Gita, though, has several other compounds involving the word yoga. The two best known, probably karma yoga and bhakti yoga. Those are its two main techniques. Yoga by means of devotion, and getting into yoga through action. But the action, as this verse 49 from the second chapter points out, only really is liberating if you engage in another practice. You get into a state of clarity through mastery of your subtlest state of mind, the buddhi, the intellect, which therefore means that what you do is wise, because you're, as the Gita puts it, skillful in your action, neither seeking success nor being deterred by failure, but just doing things for the sake of doing them, completely detached in your activity. That's the way towards the state of yoga. Nothing will ever disturb you. You just do what needs doing. Similarly with devotion, the practice of devotion is to lead into this state of pure clarity about who you really are. And it's a very effective means, devotional yoga, because it means that the center of your reverence is not the idea of yourself, but something beyond the mind, beyond this person, beyond this limited, contracted little person here in the corner, and instead embracing something much bigger. And a lot of yoga philosophy is actually trying to do that. The state of yoga is bigger than the idea of me. It's beyond physicality in that sense. It's pure spirituality. And therefore, there are many ways to attain it. And Patanjali himself has a system of, the yoga compound, yoga by means of action, kriya, and he offers something you can do with your body, something you can do with your mind, something you can do with your spirit. And that is basically engaging some form of disciplined effort. Chanting quietly to yourself sacred texts, or offering yourself up to the sort of the archetype of liberation, the divine Ishvara, and all of that is still contained within the idea of those are the things you do to get to the state of yoga. So point 2, yoga not thought of as a practice traditionally. Yoga was the outcome of the practice, and therefore there are, so to speak, many roads to Rome. Depends, on our proclivity, which one we might take. And there's also the possibility of constant innovation. Yoga has continued to evolve and produced all manner of inventive systems of physical practice that, can still lead towards this state. But one has to understand what that state is, and also, therefore, that one needs to go beyond the attachment to the practice. It's not just performance of shapes on mats that is the key. It's the concentration practice, the transcendence of attachment to the body, the seeing beyond the mind that leads to that state. It's not just perfecting your postures. So moving on to the final point that is often kind of assumed, I think, today in the context of yoga teaching and practice, that yoga is for health and wellness. It's make us feel better in our embodiment and better equipped to engage in worldly existence, to go about our day-to-day activities in a way that is effectively spiritualized. There's no harm in that, and there's certainly an evolution towards that point throughout the intervening centuries, and this is something that has been invented by culturally appropriative Westerners in recent years. You hear the same thing from the Prime Minister of India on Yoga Day. I mean, that's the idea that people have developed in India about yoga practice. But go to Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and you're not going to get up from your Shavasana by the sounds of it. It really does seem to be pointing towards the complete renunciation of the body, the renunciation of the body's engagement with the material world, liberation by default, as we saw in that philosophy of separation, is to go one state beyond actually even just the steady-minded clarity of samadhi, but to just disengage forever from material things, resting always in the pure state of Purusha. That's Kaivalya. That's the separation, detachment, aloneness, as it literally means. So that's not very worldly at all. And that seems to be a consistent theme in yoga texts, in case you think, oh, it's that's just some old idea that he's harping on about. You go to the Middle Ages, at the Pradipika from maybe 500-600 years ago, exactly the same sort of description. The yogi who's liberated looks like he's dead. Released from all states, free of all thoughts, but also liberated from all sensory engagement with anything around him, doesn't even know himself or others, just beyond. So we've blown his brains out. And this is a very common way of talking about this ultimate state of yoga, because it consists of renouncing. For most of the history of yoga, it was a renunciate approach to life, because the world is what keeps us entangled in suffering. Through the senses, as I was explaining, we get caught up in like and dislike, the desire to try and manage the world outside us, and obtain satisfaction from stuff. And instead, yoga was a philosophy of saying goodbye to all that, disappearing inside, never wanting anything ever again, and in its crudest form, never doing anything ever again, because it's the doing of things that keeps us entangled. And so, we get this sort of description repeatedly. Another one here from the Mahabharata, so rewinding to 2,000 years ago, exactly the same thing. The yogi who's engaged in yoking his mind, again, this verb yuj has a participle, yukta, so one whose mind is yoked, is engaged in yoga. He looks like this. He's basically dead to the world again, motionless like a stone, not wanting anything like a piece of wood, and absolutely no mental or physical activity, and definitely no sensory engagement with things. Everything internalized. Now, of course, we could say, well, people did this like going on retreat. You do this for a while, you get clearer about who you are, and then you get up and wander off into the world and live a nice liberated life. Unfortunately, these texts don't talk about that stuff. That's what we add to them to make them make sense to us today. They seem to have just chosen to stop at that point. The basic kind of algorithm of liberation was to get to the possibility of renouncing everything, including the body, and then you might be spiritualized. They don't tend to talk about living in the world in a liberated state until about 1,000 years ago, when things get a little bit more funky as physical practice and tantric philosophy start to come together to say, maybe the body isn't the enemy after all. Maybe the body is just part of this sort of divine energetic pulsation, emanating out from a single source into the variety of things, and from any of those things you can understand back up into yourself and through yourself the totality of the world, all just divine. And that leads to a slightly looser approach to these sorts of practices, but still, they're still pretty disciplined. And that's the algorithm of yoga, as I was saying. It's discipline, get the thing under control. The most important thing to control is the body. And this metaphor from the Katha Upanishad, the earliest text to define yoga, talking very clearly about this detachment process of liberating the pure self, says you need to understand that self as a passenger. And this body is just this flesh suit that we put on to stumble our way through the life that we're currently inhabiting, but it's just a vehicle. Know the body is a chariot, and then understand how to get that chariot under control. And it basically comes down to what we've already heard about. Get the senses, which are these horses that can pull your chariot off all over the place, disciplined by means of the reins of the mind. By focusing your mind through some wise engagement of your intellect, you'll turn everything away from the world, bring your chariot to a standstill, let go of it eventually in terms of the body, and just rest in your spiritualized detachment, happy forever, because you've let go of the quest to be happy in the world. And that's the way that this is described in many texts. Other early Upanishads have a similar outlook. The Shvetashvatara Upanishad borrows that metaphor of the chariot from the Katha Upanishad, also talks about the restraint of the mind and the senses. However, it has some echoes of the sort of bridging philosophy of Tantra that leads to later practices of physical yoga, in which the body can be harnessed. And you see a hint of that here in this description of physical benefits. They're not really held up as the goal. They just seem to arise as the first signs that yoga is working. But they do include some quite strikingly different things. Health, as opposed to looking like a piece of wood. Bright face, pleasant voice, smelling sweetly, don't need to go to the toilet much. You're basically in a state of well-being. So there is that sense that yoga practice has these potential benefits, but almost like the magic powers that can arise, the traditional more ascetic view is they need to be renounced if you want to get liberated. Attachment to the body is an obstacle. And really, this sort of language is much more like what you find in later texts on physical yoga. To go back to what we were talking about, the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, which was the text that mentioned the different types of yoga, Hatha Yoga, Laya Yoga, Mantra Yoga, etc. That also has a reference to attaining this state where things are a little bit more purified. But most early texts, it's not talking about purifying the body. Purifying the body for Patanjali is a lot different. It consists of disgust for one's own body, as he puts it here. The fruit of the niyama of shaucha, cleanliness, is to cultivate disgust for the body, says 40th Sutra of the second chapter. The evidence that you're practicing this properly is to see the impossibility of cleaning this body. It just oozes substances and eventually decays. It's a useless thing. It just keeps us entangled in the world. What we need to do is develop the correct attitude to it of detachment. Seeing the shamefulness of the body, says the commentary that goes with that sutra, one becomes unattached to it like an ascetic. Seeing this true nature of the body, the yogi desires to give it up. Well, yes, we can't really overlook that. That's not the language of modern yoga practitioners. It's a clear indication that the Yoga Sutra has a completely different objective to us. It's talking about world renunciation. But that's not to say we can't get inspired by some of the ideas in the Yoga Sutra. They're actually very helpful. However, there are distinctions between what it teaches and what we might like to do with them. Some of those teachings, what we might like to do with them, have arisen from a very radical place. And what we might turn them into can still be inspired by not even a watered down version of that necessarily, just a different application of it. So as explained here in Roots of Yoga by Jim Mallinson and Mark Singleton, the common objective of all real early yoga practice was the elimination of this problem that's created by being active in the world. Karmic traces, karma means action, taking action in the world leaves residue, particularly in the mind. That residue has a particular impact. It orients us towards doing more things in the world. The objective of yoga is moksha, release, literally that means, from interaction with stuff outside of us. And instead, this other word, nirvana, often associated with Buddhism, but Buddhism, yoga come from a similar place. And nirvana you find in the Bhagavad Gita and also elsewhere in the Mahabharata, just means blowing out a flame. And the thing that's extinguished really is the idea of me that needs stuff in the world. The eradication of a personal identity, in fact. Or as they put it here in a very stark kind of framing, ontological suicide, destruction of one's very being, less likely to sell yoga workshops than tips on techniques. However, that is still the aim of yoga practice, really, if we're going to be true to the spirit of traditional yoga. Perhaps not going all the way, the irreversible destruction of one's very being, it sounds pretty harsh, but certainly loosening our attachment to the idea of me, and definitely the idea of me as the center of the universe who needs satisfying by stuff out there, and instead to see the world from a different perspective, a more expansive perspective, in which the satisfaction of this needy little greed monster in the mind is not the number one priority. Perhaps just being okay with the world as it is a good place to start, and moving from there, if we're fortunate enough to get that bit established. And that's certainly not in itself a very easy thing to do, accepting the world as it is. Although that is what Patanjali said contentment consists of, going back to his yamas and niyamas. Anyway, I'm digressing from the main point really of everything we've been talking about is that yoga has changed a lot since early days, thankfully, otherwise many of us might never have gone near it. However, it's helpful to see those distinctions, to see how things evolve, and collapsing everything back into the idea of yoga means union. It's all about practice, and the goal of that practice is to deliver health and well-being in this lifetime, in this body, can blind us actually to some of its real power. It was developed in these ways to cut through the very problem of existence that people 2,500 years ago were perplexed by. And it still has the power to liberate us from some of our entanglement in suffering as a result, provided we see what it is that we're supposed to be detaching from, the idea of self-centered, self-serving, self-satisfaction. So just to summarize, as I put things in my book, The Truth of Yoga, there really is no need, obviously, to take any of these ancient texts and expect to find the answers to 21st century yoga or 21st century life in them. That doesn't mean that they're useless, though. Obviously, we're still capable of getting inspired by these texts. And this is what I do. I talk about these things. I find it fascinating to try and make connections between the past and the present. But when we're doing that, we are bound to be reinterpreting things. It's just the nature of things. We're adapting teachings to modern contexts. And the tendency often is to translate them as if that's what the text itself always said, or to suggest that our idea of what yoga is now is what yoga always was. And I think we've missed something important out if we do that. Perhaps the most important lesson of Patanjali's emphasis on telling the difference, the discernment, to distinguish two things that are not the same. What we need to do instead is to acknowledge what these original texts had to say about yoga, and at the same time, what we're doing with our inspiration that we're drawing from these old texts. And they might not be the same thing. And if they're not the same thing, we need to be clear about that. And that is, I think, a way of embodying both respect for tradition and at the same time, the possibility of yoga continuing to evolve through us, to allow us to make our own choices, to have our own philosophy even of what we're doing and why. But at the same time, recognizing what really might be foundational to the ideas of yoga in traditional texts that enable us to connect what we do now back to some of those earlier sources. And so how we go about that is, of course, up to us. But the texts themselves are still saying what they say. So if you're curious about diving a little bit deeper into the earliest teachings on yoga, I have an online course on the early Upanishads, which, as we've seen, really are the building blocks for many subsequent teachings of yoga, the philosophical roots, perhaps, of yoga, certainly the inspiration for many other texts that become more closely associated with yoga practice, and even philosophies that develop much, much later have some connection back to these sort of well springs of inspiration for Indian spiritual practitioners of way back when, and potentially us today. So in the course, I'll be presenting material a little bit like this, talking for a while on pre-recorded video format with slides, helping to show how things fit together, while also delving into these texts, reading some of them for ourselves, and then coming together for a live Q&A discussion interactively to draw our own inspiration from what we've been exploring, perhaps, or to ask questions, to clarify ideas, to see how we get from there to here and wherever we might go next from these texts. So if that interests you, we start in the live version of the course next Monday, October 31st, and the course will run for 4 weeks, 4 modules, 4 live sessions, tying all the threads together. If you happen to be watching this way in the distant future, you'll still be able to tune in and watch recordings, but the live version is really the juice of things. And if you were here at the beginning of the talk, you will remember that I was supposed to be sharing with you the replay of an interactive session where Q&A was also part of the discussion. Unfortunately, I forgot to press the button. So the Q&A aspect won't be here for you to see. There are other videos you can find on my YouTube channel where you see that if you're curious to see how that works. Lots of great questions were asked. Lots of really interesting people also on the call, and we'll be there in the course with different philosophical perspectives. Teachers, practitioners, curious armchair observers, all sorts of different ways of approaching this material. There have been many people inspired by the Upanishads, from the poet T.S. Eliot to I think the philosopher Schopenhauer. So we can go on all sorts of different tangents. I need to be careful that I don't go off on one right now and get to the point and tie things up before we wind up spending too long here together. And at the same time, there is always the opportunity to stay on the call, on the course, if people do have more questions. There's also the opportunity to ask questions in an interactive forum at any time, including once the live version has passed. And you can always email me if you have questions. I'll share an address where you can do that in a moment. For now, though, if you're watching this soon after it was delivered, before the course begins, you can use this code, UPA, all caps, _108 for a 10% discount, and that will be valid until midnight on Saturday, so for the next 72 hours at the time of speaking. And I hope some of you will be tempted to come and engage in this inquiry with us, because really, if yoga is anything, it's inquiry, and the Upanishads are really grounded in a tradition of inquiry, asking big questions. Who am I? What am I here for? What's it all about? How does everything fit together? What can I do to suffer less? So we'll be exploring those questions broadly, as well as in terms of how the Upanishads discuss them. And if that appeals to you, I'd love to have you with us for the course. If you have any questions, whether it's about the course, whether it's about anything I've been saying, whether it's in the future about anything to do with yoga history and philosophy, always happy to answer questions. You can reach me via my website, danielsimpson.info/contact. And just finally, to get to the course itself, you'll need to go to truthofyoga.com, which is where it's hosted. truthofyoga.com/courses. You will find all of the courses. The Upanishads course is on there as well. So thank you for your one-pointed focus, coming back to that idea of yuj in the sense of samadhi. And thank you also for those who were originally here on the live version of this replay, which is replaying the discussion we had, for the great questions that you asked there, if any of you are tuning back in to listen again. I hope I did justice to what you listened to the first time. Fingers crossed we didn't miss anything out the second time around. Anyway, thank you again, and wish you all the best, and hope to see you soon for some early Upanishads. So I'll leave this there and say bye for now.